Henry Miller, a frail World War II veteran, faced losing the home he had built with his own hands simply because of unpaid taxes. The cold, unyielding bank seemed determined to treat him as just another debtor, indifferent to his sacrifices. Yet on the day of the trial, a surprising ally and a courtroom full of supporters turned the tide in a way no one expected. But just wait to see the shocking twist of this story and why justice in the end truly prevailed. Henry Miller was 92 years old. His hair was silver, his back a little bent with time, but his eyes still carried the quiet fire of a man who had once stood firm when the world seemed to collapse around him. He was a World War II veteran, one of those who had seen the unimaginable and returned to build a life in peace. After the war, with his bare hands and unshakable determination, Henry repaired the small wooden house that became his safe haven. Every beam, every brick carried the weight of his sweat and his pride. Inside that modest home, the walls told his story. There was a faded black and white photograph of him in uniform, a younger Henry staring at the camera with the intensity of someone who knew the cost of freedom. Next to it hung his medal for bravery, not polished, not displayed in a case, just resting quietly as a reminder of sacrifices most could barely imagine. To Henry, this house wasn't just shelter, it was a piece of his soul, the foundation of his memories, the place where his late wife had sung in the kitchen and where his children once ran through the hallway. Losing it would mean losing the last tangible proof that his life had mattered. And yet, on a cold winter morning, as wind rattled against the fragile window frames, a sharp knock echoed through his home. Henry shuffled slowly to the door, his cane tapping the floor. When he opened it, he was met not with a neighbor or a friend, but with two men in dark coats, one holding a thick envelope. "You have to leave the house," the younger one said flatly. His voice carried no warmth, no compassion. "The bank sold it at auction due to unpaid taxes. You'll need to vacate the property." The words landed like a heavy blow. For a moment, Henry didn't respond. His hand gripped the doorframe as though the house itself might vanish beneath him. He knew he had fallen behind on paperwork. He knew his pension barely stretched far enough to cover medicine, food, and heat. But he had never imagined it would come to this. From across the street, Sarah, his longtime neighbor, watched the scene unfold. She was in her early 60s, and Henry had always reminded her of her own father. Steady, kind, dependable. She stepped closer, her eyes already welling with tears as she overheard the conversation. "Are you serious?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "This man risked everything for this country, and you're telling him to get out of his home." But the men at the door did not flinch. Their faces remained unmoved, rehearsed, businesslike. To them, Henry Miller was not a war hero, not a father, not a neighbor. He was a file in a cabinet, a number on a ledger. In their eyes, he was just another debtor. Henry felt his chest tighten. Anger and disbelief boiled beneath the weight of his silence. He wanted to argue, to shout, to remind them that the freedoms they enjoyed had been bought by men like him. But the words caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there, gripping his cane, his dignity the only shield he had left. For Sarah and the neighbors who soon gathered outside, the injustice was unbearable. They whispered in outrage, shaking their heads, unable to believe what they were seeing. The image was seared into their hearts. A frail old man, once a protector of the nation, now cornered in his own home by the very system he had defended. It was the kind of moment that struck like lightning. For those who witnessed it, and for anyone who would later hear Henry's story, anger was the first and only reaction. Pure, undeniable anger at a system that could turn its back on someone who had given everything. And so, the stage was set. Henry's fight for dignity, for justice, for his very home, had begun. Henry lowered himself slowly into his old wooden chair, the one that had been with him for decades. Its creaks echoed through the small, dimly lit room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and covered his face with trembling hands. For the first time in many years, the man who had once aired down storms on foreign soil now felt utterly powerless within the walls of his own home. The numbers on the bank's papers blurred in his mind. He had never been careless with responsibility, but now, at 92, his body betrayed him daily, and so did his memory. His pension was modest, stretched thin to cover his medicine, the food on his table, and the heating bill that climbed every winter. The tax increase had slipped past him quietly, hidden in the endless envelopes of official language he could no longer easily read or understand. He was not reckless. He was not negligent. He was simply an old man, too weary to wrestle with forms and deadlines, too tired to fight against the tide of bureaucracy. And now, the house he had built with his own 2 hands, repaired after storms, filled with decades of memories, all of it stood on the edge of being taken away. "I'm about to lose everything I built with my own hands," he whispered, his voice breaking in the silence of the room. That whisper carried the weight of a lifetime. He remembered the first day he had brought his wife through the front door, the way her laughter had filled the hallways. He remembered tucking his children into bed, the smell of her cooking on holidays, the sound of grandchildren running across the porch. Every corner of the house was alive with ghosts of joy, love, and resilience. The thought of strangers walking through it, erasing his story as if it had never existed, was unbearable. News of Henry's struggle began to spread through the small town. At first it was neighbors who talked, then local shops, and soon it reached the community center. People spoke of him with sympathy and respect. They remembered how he used to help fix fences, how he greeted everyone with a nod and a smile. They knew him as more than the old man with the cane. He was Henry, the man who had always been there. Yet as much as their hearts ached for him, a quiet resignation crept into their words. "What can be done?" some asked. "The bank won't bend. The law doesn't make exceptions." The harshest blow came from the company's lawyer, who addressed the press without hesitation. His words were sharp, final, without room for compassion. "The law is the same for everyone. Age and past achievements don't matter here." To those who heard, it sounded like a dismissal of Henry's entire life. As though the years of service, the decades of contribution, the sacrifices made were worth nothing in the face of numbers on a page. And so the pain deepened. It was not just the threat of losing a house. It was the weight of being forgotten, of realizing that time had turned him invisible. For Henry, the battle felt already lost. For the townspeople, the injustice stung. But even they doubted that anyone could stand against the machine of paperwork and policy. The story of Henry Miller became more than one man's burden. It was a mirror, showing how easily those who had once been strong could be overlooked, how quickly dignity could be placed on trial. The silence in Henry's home that night was heavy. The chair beneath him held his body, but his spirit felt like it was slipping. And in that silence, pain became almost unbearable. A deep wound carved not by war or enemies, but by the very system he had once defended. It seemed the battle was lost before it even began. The day of the trial arrived with an unusual quiet that seemed to stretch across the town. Sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long patterns on the polished wooden floors. Henry Miller walked slowly toward the building, leaning on his cane. Each step heavier than the last, but carried with a stubborn determination that refused to let despair claim him entirely. Inside the courtroom, an energy unlike anything the town had seen for decades pulsed in the air. Neighbors filled every bench, some clutching homemade signs that read, "A home for a hero." Veterans from nearby towns arrived in neat uniforms, their medals gleaming, carrying silent weight and solidarity. Even local college students, who had only recently learned of Henry's plight through social media and word of mouth, had gathered, holding handmade banners and quietly whispering encouragement to one another. The room was crowded, yet it was quiet, a respectful, expectant hush that spoke louder than words. Every pair of eyes turned toward the front as the courtroom doors opened. Henry's heart pounded, though his breath came slow and measured. He had faced storms before, but nothing quite like this. The collective will of an entire community, waiting for justice to tip in his favor. Then the doors swung wide, and Judge Thomas Harper entered. The crowd held its breath, but what Henry saw made him blink in disbelief. The man at the bench was not in the traditional black robe. Instead, he wore a crisp military uniform, adorned with polished medals and ribbons. Silver hair framed a face lined with experience and quiet authority, a face that spoke of battles fought and lessons learned in the harshest conditions. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Cameras clicked. For Henry, the room seemed to shrink around him, and for the first time in many long days, a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. Judge Harper's gaze swept over the room, taking in the faces of neighbors, veterans, students, and reporters. Then finally, it landed on Henry. There was a nod, subtle but carrying a lifetime of understanding. The weight of recognition and respect filled the space between them. It was more than a gesture. It was a silent acknowledgement. Henry's life, his sacrifices, and his contributions mattered. The judge spoke, and his voice, calm yet unwavering, echoed through the courtroom. We gather here not only to interpret the law, but to remember the human lives behind it. A home is not just a building. It is the story of those who live within it, the history they carry, and the dignity they earn every day. This man, Henry Miller, has earned that dignity through decades of service, through trials far greater than paperwork could ever impose. Henry's neighbors whispered among themselves, sharing glances of disbelief and relief. Even the bank representatives, accustomed to certainty and unbending rules, felt the weight of a collective truth pressing upon them. The courtroom, once a place of fear and tension, now seemed alive with the quiet power of hope and justice intertwined. As Judge Harper continued, the story of Henry's life, his bravery, his work, his unwavering commitment to his family and community was woven into the proceedings. Each word, each pause, reinforced a truth that the law alone sometimes overlooks. Human lives, and the love and history embedded in them, carry weight beyond numbers and deadlines. Henry straightened in his chair, his cane resting lightly at his side. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders lifted, his gaze steady. Around him, the room seemed to pulse with possibility. He could feel it. The tide was turning, and the battle that had once seemed lost before it even began now held a glimmer of victory. The courtroom was no longer just a place of trial. It was a sanctuary of hope, of community, and of recognition. And in that moment, Henry Miller knew that he was not alone, not ever again. The courtroom was tense, hanging on the edge of expectation, as Judge Thomas Harper carefully listened to the arguments from both sides. The bank's representatives spoke in measured tones, citing policies, numbers, and regulations. Henry, frail yet dignified, had his own voice heard through the advocacy of his neighbors and a volunteer lawyer who knew the weight of human stories. Every word seemed to vibrate with the tension of years lived, sacrifices made, and a life built with steady hands and an unshakable spirit. Then Judge Harper leaned forward, removed his glasses, and let his gaze sweep across the room. The courtroom fell silent. Even the faint rustle of papers seemed to pause, waiting. Finally, his eyes locked onto the bank's representative, and his voice, calm yet commanding, resonated like a bell through the hall. "You say the law is equal for everyone," he began, each word deliberate. "But what does equality mean if it forgets the sacrifices of those who defended it? This man, Henry Miller, once risked everything to ensure that you and all of us could live under the protection of law and freedom. And now, in return for his life's service, you would strip him of his only home. Not in my courtroom. Not today. Not ever." A hush fell over the room. Henry, seated with his cane by his side, felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a cautious, fragile hope. Around him, neighbors held each other's hands, veterans straightened their shoulders, and students leaned forward, absorbing every word as if it were a lesson in honor itself. Judge Harper's ruling came down like a wave breaking over a shore. The eviction was canceled. The debt, once overwhelming, was to be reevaluated with fairness in mind. The state would step in to cover a portion of the financial burden, ensuring that Henry's hard-earned home would remain his. For a heartbeat, silence lingered, disbelief mingling with relief. And then the courtroom erupted. Applause thundered, claps echoed against the walls, and tears welled up in the eyes of strangers and friends alike. People embraced, shook hands, and whispered words of triumph. It was more than a legal victory. It was a celebration of respect, community, and the enduring value of a life lived with courage and integrity. Henry rose slowly, his cane steadying him, his posture small but proud. He looked around at the faces that had gathered in support, the ones who had refused to let him face this challenge alone. His voice, though soft, carried an unmistakable clarity. "I knew I hadn't fought in vain," he said quietly, almost to himself, but every ear in the room caught it. "My country still remembers its soldiers, and today I feel remembered not just by the law, but by all of you." The emotion in the room was palpable. Children stared wide-eyed at the idea that a single person with courage and support could withstand the weight of injustice. Adults, seasoned by life's challenges, felt inspiration stir in their hearts, a reminder that honor, humanity, and compassion could prevail even when the world seemed indifferent. Outside the courthouse, people lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of shared triumph. Conversations hummed with admiration and reflection. Veterans spoke quietly to each other, nodding with understanding. Neighbors exchanged stories of Henry's resilience. Even the college students, who had arrived with a sense of curiosity, walked away carrying lessons of courage, empathy, and civic responsibility that would stay with them for years. Henry returned to his home that afternoon, the familiar walls embracing him with the quiet promise of safety and continuity. Yet the true victory extended far beyond bricks and mortar. It was in the lessons taught to a town, in the courage inspired across generations, and in the affirmation that, even in a world that sometimes seems harsh and unyielding, justice and humanity can shine brightly, lighting the way for all who dare to believe in them.